Hi, I'm Mark Cunningham with Grace Management. If you own rental real estate long enough, one problem you will eventually have is how to get rid of a bad tenant. It happens to all of us. It doesn't matter how good you are. Eventually, you will have a problem tenant. Now, typically that problem tenant falls into one or two categories. Either they're a problem tenant because they have problems paying, or they're lease violation issues. So let's look at the non-payment of rent issue. Colorado state law is pretty clear on that. In those instances where a tenant has problems paying rent, you want to move quickly but compassionately to either get the tenant back to a paying on-time scenario or get them out of the property. We tell tenants who have problems paying their rent, look, we can do one of two things. You can do one of two things. You can move or you can pay on time, but you can't not pay on time and stay in the property. That's just not an option. And that can be a hard thing to do as a landlord. You want to be compassionate, you want to work with them, but you also have to treat this like a business, and you can't be taken advantage of by professional tenants. So when a tenant doesn't pay rent, you want to have a very clear-cut policy in place on when rent is due, when rent is late, how you will enforce the late fee, when will you serve and begin the processing of a 3-day legal eviction process. So the process looks like this. Your lease agreement has your rent due on a particular date. It's very common to have a lease agreement that gives somewhat of a grace period on the rent due date. Let's say that's the third day of the month. Rent's due on the first, tenant has until the third comes and goes, tenant hasn't paid. Be proactive, pick up the phone, drive to the tenant's property, see what's going on. Tenants are scared when they're in this situation, they don't have the rent, so they may not reach out to you. So you as the landlord want to be proactive, reach out to them, find out what's going on. If they're not able to immediately bring in payment, at that point you want to prepare and post the legal state required notice, commonly referred to as a 3-day notice for demand. What that does, it has to be physically served upon the property. That starts the clock ticking, the legal clock, and it gives the tenant 3 additional days per Colorado state law to come up with the rent amount in full. If they bring that payment in during that 3-day period, you are required by law to accept that payment, which you probably want to do anyway. Once the 3 days is up, at that point in time, if they do come in with payment, you do not legally have to accept that. Once that 3 days is up, you can initiate the next phase of the eviction process. You typically want to involve an attorney at this part of the eviction, but that notice would be forwarded to your attorney and they would set an actual court date with the judge for the judge to grant possession of the property back to you for non-payment of rent as the landlord of the property. We find that when that happens, in the majority of the cases, those tenants know they haven't paid. They typically don't even show up for the court proceedings, which is kind of the best case scenario. If they do show up, they can file an answer and they can request their day in court. But when that happens, when a tenant doesn't pay rent and you go through that legal eviction process, it's pretty cut and dry. You don't want to mess around with that. You want to be compassionate, but you want to move quickly to move a tenant out of a property who's not able to pay their rent or make some type of an arrangement with them. If you get in the habit of taking rent late, state law says and judicial law says you can potentially forego your ability to either charge a late fee or to maintain the status of saying rent is always due on the first. So you cannot be very wishy-washy with this. You've got to hold to the terms of your lease agreement. Now, the second type of reason you may want to get a tenant out is more for lease violations. This is where it gets sticky. This is where it's not as cut and dry. Are those lease violations because they're doing a bad job of maintaining the lawn? Maybe they have a small rent balance and they haven't paid that in some period of time. Maybe they're not keeping the property in as high of quality of condition as you would like them to do. What you need to decide as the landlord is how far do you want to push that? Do you really want to evict a tenant maybe because their lawn's a little bit long? Probably not. But at what point in time does it come that you do have to evict because they're neglecting the lawn or neglecting the interior of the property? That's where you want to have a very solid and strong lease agreement in place, which outlines what the tenant's responsibilities are and what will happen if they do not abide by those responsibilities. Another key thing to look at in those instances is what is the expiration date of the lease. Let's say you have a tenant and they're not taking care of the property, but their lease agreement expires in another 60 days. Well, don't go through the eviction process now. It's going to cost you a lot of money, time, and headache. Simply give them a notice of non-renewal so that when when the lease comes up for renewal in 60 days, you're not going to be renewing that lease agreement. It's a much easier way. It keeps tempers down, keeps the tension down simply by not renewing the lease agreement. So always keep in mind what the lease expiration date is. Your goal as the landlord is to make sure that this happens in a smooth, orderly process. Moving a tenant out for non-payment of rent or for lease violations issues is never fun, it's never easy, and it's just as stressful for the tenant as it is for you, the landlord. So you need to come into that emotionally properly prepared to deal with the tenant, to handle the tenant, and to hopefully be able to work with them to move them out of the property. It's not always the case, but that's your goal as a professional investor. The best thing we ever had happen to us around a bad case scenario is we actually had to evict a tenant one time for non-payment of rent. We went all the way through the court process, got a judgment granted against them. We actually had to have a physical eviction where the sheriff comes out to the property, moves their stuff out. We don't want that to happen. It's a worst case scenario, but we worked very closely with the tenant in this whole process, even though they wouldn't move. 2 weeks later, we actually got a thank you card in the mail from this tenant saying, thank you for working with me as you did through this eviction process. We were pretty surprised by that because it was a bad case scenario, but that is the goal. The goal is to make it as easy as possible to mitigate the time, mitigate the expenses, mitigate the damages. But you do want to bring an attorney in. If you're not working with a property management company and you get to that point, maybe you go find a property manager to kind of take on that headache, take on that hassle so you don't have to do it. But those are a couple ways to get bad tenants out of good properties.